Oh, didn't see you there. From the beginning of our nation's history, America has had a distinct identity, and this identity has often been closely linked to democracy. From the founding of America, the settlers came from the Old World, escaping persecution to come to the New World, and they founded Jamestown, Virginia, and with it the House of Burgesses in 1619. This, though in practice was mostly controlled by Parliament, was the first form of democratic government and largely contributed to shaping the American identity based on government.
After Americans gained independence from Great Britain in 1776, the newborn nation needed to develop its own government. America's government was founded by the Declaration of Independence, which was influenced by the ideas of John Locke, that stated all men were created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. You see, this really exemplified the idea of a national identity founded on democracy. In a world where many countries were ruled by monarchs, America was fighting for what they believed in: government of the people, for the people, by the people. Our founding fathers inspired American colonists to rally behind this national idea of democracy, turning a ragtag group of settlers into a force that would defeat the British Empire. Now obviously, nobody jumped ship from the security of their lives just to support a radical new idea. Thomas Paine's common sense had the power to take this idealistic policy of democracy and transform it into a national movement. By logically explaining why America should secede from Britain and govern themselves democratically, Paine convinced many people to closely identify with American democracy.
The Constitution was not written until 10 years after America gained its independence. Originally, the Articles of Confederation were used to govern the nation, but they proved to be very ineffective. The federal government was not strong enough to collect taxes from the state, and this led to an economic downfall. After the Revolution, Americans feared a government that was too strong. Therefore, the Articles of Confederation did not give enough economic, legislative, and military power to the federal government. The states suffered massive amounts of death after the war, and one angry farmer named Daniel Shea was fed up with the federal government as it had no power to collect taxes from the state. Daniel Shea led an uprising against the federal government. The revolt failed, and Daniel Shea was thrown into prison, but this showed that the federal government was too weak under the Articles and change was needed. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, they made sure to give the federal government more domain over the states. However, many anti-federalists felt that the Constitution took away too many liberties from the people, and to compromise, Federalists introduced the Bill of Rights. The inclusion of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution contributed to America's national identity. These 10 points were the basis of what made America unique from other countries and how they guaranteed certain freedoms for their citizens. Even with the Bill of Rights, though, the Constitution was still very controversial in the 19th century. Anti-Federalists, like Thomas Jefferson, believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution, while Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson and Hamilton argued over the national faith, but both used the Constitution to support their argument. Jefferson had a strict interpretation, saying that the Constitution did not explicitly say that Congress could create the national bank, while Hamilton used the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution to deem the national bank necessary. These opposing views would shape how the Constitution would be used to govern America and contribute to its national identity. The Constitution would then on be used to govern American laws, such as with the Judicial Review in the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803. This monumental case set a precedent with the Constitution on how laws would be governed in America. The American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence had a large impact on American development and even development of other countries, such as France after the Revolution. Due to the prevalent influence of the American way of government, another American identity developed based on this belief that American way was the only way.
From George Washington through the 19th century and even into the early 20th century, America was an isolationist nation. As a new nation, often referred to as a democratic experiment, the U.S. was very inwardly focused, using tariffs to stretch the growth of American business, and generally staying out of conflict. Even George Washington himself stated that America must remain isolated from involvement in foreign affairs, so as not to overwhelm the young nation. Following the American Revolution, starting in 1776, the French had their own revolution in 1789. Since the French based the rebellion largely on the American Declaration of Independence, and since the French provided alliance and aid to the Americas during their revolution, it was not surprising that the French expected help from the U.S. during their own revolution. However, the new nation decided not to intervene and to remain an isolationist state. Another conflict shortly afterwards was the War of 1812. In this war, America wanted to trade with both British and French sides, and not to acknowledge any military alliance to another. In the end, pressure from both sides pushed America into helping the French, but it was against the wishes of the U.S., and shortly after, the country returned to its internal functioning. During the Civil War, the Confederacy pleaded to Britain in the hopes of receiving military aid. However, the Union quickly made sure to prevent the British from being involved and left the Civil War to be a national issue.
Even as far as the 20th century, America stayed as an isolationist nation. When World War I broke out in the European continent, America wanted nothing to do with the conflict. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, also supported American isolationism and neutrality and wanted to neutrally trade with powers on both sides of the war. The American people identified so heavily with isolationism at the time that Woodrow Wilson was able to advertise himself as the president who kept America out of the war, and he won re-election. After the incident with Louisiana and the Zimmerman Note, Wilson led a reluctant America into war. After the war, when Wilson proposed the League of Nations, the isolationist identity of America won over, and the League of Nations did not go through in America. America's isolationist policy lasted from its founding until it was finally killed with the events of World War II. However, even in the brief break in isolationism during World War I led the American people to be afraid of the world they had been exposed to, leading to an immense feeling of nativism following World War I.
As citizens of a nation that developed mainly isolated from international influence, Americans also identified heavily with strong nativism when their isolation was threatened. One of the largest waves of immigration came around in the late 19th century. When this wave of immigrants came to America in this time, they were accepted into cities like New York and processed through Ellis Island. However, since most of them did not speak English, and since most of them were poor, they were shunned by Americans at the time, and tended to gravitate towards each other, creating ethnic neighborhoods such as Little Italy. Immigrants were further resented in this time because they were used as strikebreakers when there was labor unrest, making it harder for labor unions to advance. One of the greatest surges of nativism came directly after World War I. During World War I, Russia was an allied power. However, during the war, they dropped out to deal with their own internal struggles. This internal struggle was the Russian Revolution of 1917. After the revolution, there was a large fear of communism in America, which was backed up by the already present nature of nativism. In the 1920s legislation, such as the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, it was passed in order to suppress Catholics and poor people, who were typically immigrants. The KKK also made a resurgence during this time. In a time where America feared and resented the immigrant population, it was easy for an organization such as the KKK to expand their area of hate and gain membership. They even made their way into pop culture, releasing the movie The Birth of a Nation, which was even played in the president's home under Wilson. The feeling of nativism at the time climaxed with 2 immigration quota legislations, which severely cut the number of immigrants who were allowed to enter the United States. Another aspect of the American identity is the idea of manifest destiny. When the first settlers came to America, there was still an ample amount of land in the West. America's drive for expansion started after the 1800s. The first example of this was the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the nation at the time. Americans felt that it was their God-given right to expand their territory and spread democracy. In 1819, America acquired Florida from Spain with the Adams Island Treaty. Under James Polk, America acquired Oregon and successfully annexed Texas. Frederick Turner, in his Frontier thesis, described America's exceptionalism based on its conquest over the frontier and spread of democracy. As the frontier closed, America looked overseas to acquire new lands. This would lead to America becoming an imperialist nation, spreading democracy to islands in the Pacific, such as Hawaii and the Philippines. Manifest destiny was an identity that was heavily expressed in the American people, as they believed in spreading their democracy and their culture from sea to shining sea. This is the story of our national identity. To this day, when you see an American flag, you think of the ideals of democracy and liberty and justice for all. This democracy was forged in the early days through debates over the Constitution, to developing our country as an isolationist nation, all the way until developing this country and expanding from sea to shining sea. This is the story of the American democracy, the American identity, and our history.